change and sustainable transition. And we are here for a conversation with Jacob Werksman from the European Commission, who's the head negotiator for the EU in the UNFCCC process and advisor to the Director General of DG Clima. I hope I got all that right, Jake. Let's wait for a few minutes. We have a significant number of people that have registered for this webinar, this conversation. It is, as much as we would like to make it an informal conversation, but we all know that these are informal to a certain degree. So we're waiting for people to stream in and see how, when we reach a certain point, we will then move on to our questions and so on. So let's give it a few moments for that. Before introducing my colleague Michael Melling, I think we'll like to start that formally when we start the conversation. Which doesn't mean for all of you, including Jake, that everybody believes that there is a sunshine day in Brussels with blue skies and bright sun. I mean, in these days, anything is virtual, so we never sure. Yeah. We're close to, I don't know if you see this, Jake, I've never known whether you see this thing, but we're close to 100. So yeah, well, Michael, what I will, we'll wait for get to 150 or so, and then we start. We're at 2 minutes past, Jake. I think that at this point we are at 1:15. I'm convinced that more people will come in, but nevertheless, I would like to give you the opportunity to start. Again, I'm Andre Marcoux. I'm the director of the Roundtable of Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. Together with my colleague, Michael Melling, who is now in New York State somewhere. We are here and pleased to have Jacob Werksman. Jake is the chief negotiator for the European Union in the UNFCCC negotiation advisor to Director General of DG Clima, a person with significant amount of experience in climate change on both sides of the Atlantic, who's worked in many areas for many years. I remember WRI being one of your credentials, I think, together with many others, Jake. So somebody that can talk to us within the diplomatic realm of where we are in the vision at the international level for the EU policy at this point. As you well know, we were supposed to be probably somewhere at COP26 right now in Glasgow. We were not at COP25 in Santiago, so why would we be in COP26 in Glasgow? So we are not. We are doing virtual meetings, and there are a number of events that are coming out of the next few weeks, which are organized as an echo, as a momentum for COP26. Also, to talk about the gorilla in the room, we did have a significant election that just comes a few days ago that will have echoes around the world in many areas of policy, but not least is the area of climate change policy. And we are now continuing to work towards preparing COP26 in Glasgow. How this is going to evolve given the current situation where virtual meetings are the norm. However, the urgency of climate change is not something that is waiting and something that continues to be addressed. The European Union has been a leader, and the European Green Deal is increasing looking to increase the ambition, the UNDC, from the current 40% to 55%, maybe more. We'll see what it lands. So all these things come into play in both the EU context and the domestic EU context, and the dynamic of EU politics and EU climate change policy, but certainly not divorced for the international dimension of climate change. In the end, it is a global issue. It's an issue of global commons. So these two things cannot be divorced and will never be divorced. Jake, what we'll like to do, Michael, would you like to also say some opening introduction of some sort that you would like to add a few words?
No, thank you very much, Andre. I'll leave it for Jake and for the discussion.
Very well, Jake. First thing, I think we've discussed this. What do you see the things that have happened in 2020, that the things that need to be pay attention to? What are the highlights? What are the main things, the main axis, the main processes, the main issue that are going to come up in 2021? We know that in the past, the UNSCC has played a very critical role. Clearly, the multilateral process is what's driving this. But in past examples, we know the US administration has also had different other processes that they put in place. The EU has worked with China, with Canada, to put in place other processes. How do these things profile in terms of issues and processes for coming up in 2021?
Well, thanks, Andre, and thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining this conversation. It's a unique format for me to have a chat with two friends and colleagues, knowing that there may be 100 people listening in. Well, this is one of the things that we do to entertain ourselves during COVID time. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity. Well, Andre, as you said, in trying to figure out what happens next, I think we still have to process what's already happened. And 2020 certainly was a year of many surprises that defeated the best laid plans of international climate negotiators in many ways. And so predicting what might happen in 2021 clearly carries a lot of risks as well. But certainly at the start of 2020, the plan of the European Union was to prepare as best as possible for a COP at the end of this year in Glasgow, COP26, when we and all the other parties to Paris were expected to deliver an update and enhancement of our nationally determined contribution, our emissions reduction target, to bring it more in line with what science has been telling us we need to be doing. So in light of the 1.5-degree report from the IPCC, we had reflected on our existing target and decided that in order to lead, but also very importantly, in order to contribute, we would have to revisit our target. And this, of course, came in a package from the Commission known as the European Green Deal. And so those were the headlines that started 2020 and that we had hoped would complete 2020 as a year of climate policy from the European perspective and the international perspective, concluding with a successful raising of ambition at COP26. Many things have happened since then to intervene, and most significantly COVID, taking over every aspect of our lives, including forcing a delay in the international negotiations that were to lead to Glasgow. Two key elements, strands of that work. One is what I've already described, the political momentum, the political desire to raise the level of ambition as reflected in countries' NDCs, to show that we are delivering not just ambition in terms of cutting emissions, but also that we're delivering on the financial commitments that we've made as developed countries to help developing countries deliver on their commitments as well. Another important deadline for the end of this year was providing evidence that we are on track as contributing countries towards that $100 billion goal that we set for ourselves in Paris. So that's the political dimension of the negotiations. Alongside of that were a series of more technical negotiations aimed at completing the design of what we now refer to as the Katowice or the Paris rulebook, rules on transparency and accountability that will ensure that we're not just announcing targets, but over time, we as parties to Paris are providing the information necessary to show that we're actually achieving those targets over time. So we have work to do still, and we knew we had this work at the outset of 2020 to deliver on those technical negotiations on transparency and accountability. And also, very importantly, and I know you, Andre, and Michael have been following this particularly closely, trying to complete the rules on accounting for international carbon markets and the setting up of a new international crediting mechanism on the Paris Agreement to replace the rules and the mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. So these were our challenges at the outset of 2020, the political dimensions, the technical dimensions of the negotiations. And when COVID hit, one of the first things that was clear is that multilateralism, as we've come to know it, these regular meetings of parties in person that can include up to 10 or 15,000 government negotiators and another 20,000 observers from civil society, from local authorities, from the business sector, that these kinds of meetings simply couldn't happen in COVID times. And so with much regret, the incoming COP presidency, the UK, together with the Chilean current COP presidency, decided to recommend to the parties that we postpone the COP, and that happened. Not surprisingly, the negotiations kind of went into a bit of a suspended animation without being able to sit across from each other at a table where we can ensure that the conversation is inclusive and participatory. It is very difficult to make progress on these very complex negotiations that involve a very special mix of the political and the technical. So while we've been trying to keep things going on the technical track, completing the transparency rules, moving work forward on Article 6, and with help from the think tank community and the academic community and with the Secretariat, we have been engaging. I don't think any of us felt that we would make significant progress on that this year as a result of the COP being postponed until the end of next year. However, something very interesting happened at the political level, and we're only beginning to see the initial but very significant fruits being borne out now in the EU and the conversations that are happening in China, in Japan, and in Korea, to provide some key examples. The political momentum behind ambition seems to have been maintained, despite COVID, and despite the fact that the COP itself, which was supposed to be this big moment of political accountability, has been postponed a year. And I think that really deserves reflecting on, particularly as we prepare for another year of negotiations before the COP itself arrives. So the announcements from all of those countries of their intentions, not just to raise ambition, but to be greenhouse gas neutral, net zero in their emissions by 2050 or 2060, shows that at least in this year, we didn't need a COP to drive that kind of political outcome. Something else is keeping people to that deadline, countries to that deadline that we set for ourselves in Paris to update our ambition by 2020. Part of this credit needs to go to the Secretary General and the UN leadership that has kept the pressure on. The UK and the Chilean presidency that said, even if we're postponing the COP, we're not postponing that 2020 deadline. We still expect you to deliver. Part of it, I think, is due to the ongoing bilateral diplomatic relationships between major economies. Certainly the EU has made an effort to keep the pressure on our major partners. And part of it has been a recognition, certainly within the EU and amongst many other governments, that the logic that underpinned our strategies to raise our ambition prior to COVID still makes sense in the context of a post-COVID economic recovery. This is where you're going to get these kinds of investments, or where you're going to get the returns in terms of growing new jobs, promoting innovation, improving public health, and providing opportunities to invest in a more just and equitable society. All of that was part of the logic of the European Green Deal and of the planning of other countries. The Republic of Korea, South Korea had its own Green Deal in place or in the pipeline before COVID hit. And that logic has held. And I think that that's been an important part of maintaining ambition in the minds of those countries that were committed to Paris despite COVID happening. But it also has to be based significantly on ongoing public support, public concern about the impacts of climate change, a growing awareness of what the science tells us, to some extent in some societies, an appreciation and an experience of the benefits that climate policy can bring in terms of cleaner air, more efficient public transportation, more security in terms of the sources of our energy. And I think an growing enlightened self-interest of countries that this is the direction that the world is traveling towards. And if you want to get your economy ready to compete effectively and efficiently in that new low carbon economy, it's important to send the signals now. You've got to begin to build this into your policies and your regulations. So I think that I'm hoping that's the last big story in terms of the roller coaster of headlines with regard to climate policy over the 2020 that the end of 2020 will leave us with. And there will be a number of events towards the end of this year. You mentioned the November climate dialogues that the Secretariat is arranging to happen virtually out of their headquarters in Bonn, where we'll keep the conversations going at the technical level. But there'll also be some very important high-level political events, some of them already occurring this week, and others in December to mark the 5th anniversary of Paris, where we're hoping that the countries that I've already mentioned, but other parties to Paris as well, will be announcing their intentions to raise the level of ambition, whether it's with regard to their near-term targets or their ambition to be net zero as soon as possible in the second half of this century. So that's basically, I think, where we end 2020. Looking forward to 2021, as you mentioned, Andre, there was an important election recently. I think it's still difficult at this stage to speculate exactly what that will mean in terms of international climate politics, in terms of the role that a new US administration will play in the diplomatic sphere, and in terms of what a new administration will be able to achieve in the near term, in terms of putting US domestic climate policy back on track. I think what we are learning as a result of everything that's happening this year and everything that's happened in the last 4 years is that climate leadership at the international level requires, if it's going to be viewed as credible, climate leadership at the domestic policy level as well. I think that is something that is a lesson that Paris is teaching us, that the NDCs are teaching us, that the long-term strategies are teaching us as well. So, what I think will happen in terms of the political track is that we will see that not all parties to Paris, for a variety of reasons, will be ready by the end of this year. But the opportunity to think through COVID recovery and the opportunities that provides for increasing ambition in terms of the investments of the significant new amounts of public finance that will be available will help countries to reflect over the coming year, and more of them to come forward with long-term strategies and new NDCs by the time we hit Glasgow next year. So we're hoping to see that sort of tote board diplomacy increase the number of parties that are raising their ambition. In terms of the technical negotiations, it's still not clear when the world will be safe again for the kind of multilateral diplomacy that I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, when we'll all be able to get together face to face. Naturally, according to the normal pattern of events, we would reconvene together in June next year for the intersessional meetings. I think that some are skeptical that we'll have COVID sufficiently under control to have a full-blown SB session, as we refer to it, in Bonn, and then we move on from there to Glasgow. My own personal feeling is that while parties have been deepening their understanding of where landing grounds might be on both transparency and under Article 6, there isn't a great deal more that we need to know in terms of where we can land things on these issues. And instead, what we need is the pressure of the kind of end game politics that come with a COP when we're wrapping up a package of decisions to force those final outcomes of delegations. So it's still my hope that that we'll be able to meet again, if not in the first half of next year, in the second half of next year, in a format that feels more familiar in terms of multilateral negotiations, and that we'll have a successful outcome at COP26 in Glasgow. But let me stop there, because there is so much that we can talk about in this space, and I think that the best way to make sure that whoever has dialed in to hear us have a chat or stay online is to hear what their priority interests are and see the extent to which I or you guys can address those questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. What we'll do, we'll have a few issues that we'd like to question that Michael and I will raise, but we'll try to go through those in about 20 minutes or so. Then what we'll do is we'll open it to the audience, and we'll ask people to raise their hand. I will then give them the floor where they can come on video and audio, and that can intervene and ask the question, preferably questions rather than a lot of comments. But one thing that I would want to start with, because you stopped on talking about going back to a more common setting, with something that we used to for many years now, getting together with friends and partners to discuss these things in the COP contest. What do you expect the main issue to be in Glasgow? There's still quite a few issues on the table, but what do you see as being the main issue? What do you see as being the test of success in Glasgow? At some point, history will say, where when we finished Paris and we had the Paris Agreement, we all had pictures and went home, had a great Christmas. Now, in this case, we come from Glasgow. What's it going to count as what are the issues, and what do you think you're going to claim? Yeah, this was a successful COP in the end.
Well, thanks. I don't think that the issues will have changed in terms of the main focus of Glasgow a year later. So they are the ones that I already mentioned. On the political track, it's ambition as expressed in terms of NDCs and long-term strategies, but also very importantly, particularly to developing countries, delivery on climate finance. And then on the technical track, it's transparency and accountability and the Article 6 negotiations on accounting for international carbon markets. I think what has happened in the intervening space is an effort to sort of broaden out, and this is partly through the leadership from the SG and the COP presidencies, but also I think what's happening naturally as governments begin to reflect more and more about what ambition means, to sort of broaden out our expectations of what our process can deliver. So you see, for example, the UK COP presidency talking about a series of campaigns that they want to draw the participation of not just governments, but also private sector actors and civil society and local authorities into along different themes. So it's all about ambition, but it's ambition with regard to adaptation and resilience, not just cutting emissions, but also trying to help communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change prepare for those impacts in a more effective way. It's a campaign around finance, but not just about what rich donor countries can provide in terms of contributing to that $100 billion goal, but how we can work together to move all financial flows, whether they are north-south or south-south or south-north, whether they're public or private, to align with the Paris Agreement. It is about cutting emissions, but not just about from industrial sources. It's also about the way in which we can better tap into nature and nature's own natural ability to deliver the ecosystem service of capturing and fixing carbon in a more effective way, and a way that aligns with our goals around biodiversity conservation as well. So these campaigns, which also include clean transport and a transition of the energy sector worldwide, are other ways of demonstrating ambition than simply country targets. And I think that there's a lot of potential there to produce outcomes of a different character at COP26 in Glasgow. I think that because we've postponed a year, it also means that issues that would have come later in time will now come together with these issues as well. So to give you a couple of examples, the very important element of the Paris Agreement known as the global stocktake, the ambition cycle, which we pin our hopes on with regard to the Paris Agreement, because we know that we have to constantly improve the dynamic nature of countries' ambition. And we built into the Paris Agreement this 5-year ambition cycle that will require us every 5 years to revisit the science, look at that science in relationship to the progress that we've made in implementing our existing commitments, and then up the level of ambition in our NDCs. We've never done a full ambition cycle yet. The first one will start in 2022, 2023, and deliver new targets in 2025. And because Glasgow is a year later, conversations on how to design that global stocktake, I think, will begin in earnest in 2021. And that's a big challenge. It's basically saying, we're no longer going to negotiate new treaties, no new Kyoto Protocol, no new Paris Agreement, but instead we expect the Paris Agreement ambition cycle to produce the outcomes that we would in the past have expected to emerge from a new legally binding instrument. It's a big gamble that we're taking, but in order to make sure the gamble pays off, we have to design that process well. We also were supposed to, in Glasgow, begin our initial deliberations on post-2025 climate finance goal. So as I mentioned, we've got a $100 billion annual goal that we set for ourselves from 2020 to 2025, which is the responsibility for developed countries to deliver on. But we have already started to think about and will begin our initial deliberations on what happens after 2025. And that is going to be a big challenge, because from a donor country point of view, we are on the track to, but are still finding it a stretch to deliver on 100 billion. If we're going to go beyond that in post 2025, we're going to have to find ways of broadening the donor base, bringing other countries that have become wealthy over time into the mix of contributors, and we're going to have to become much more effective at making sure that the public finance that is delivered is leveraging more and more private finance as well. So that, I think, is the kind of evolutions that have happened in the context of the postponement of COP26 a year, is a broadening of our understanding of what ambition means, but also a shortening of the time frame in which we have to start negotiating the next stage, the next stage and phase of the development of the regime overall.
It's bound. There's bound to be surprises. There's always inevitable surprises at these things, but we'll see when we get there. One thing that Rob Stowe from Harvard, then I had this on my list as well. Basically, a very simple question, but probably has no simple answer. Or maybe you can simplify the answer because if we get into technicalities, we'll get Martin here and we'll spend the next 2 days talking about this. What's stopping this Article 6 thing from moving ahead? I mean, in a nutshell, in a simplified way, not for geeks, but for people that are on this call and are not really interested in what we pontificate in that room.
Well, it is difficult to simplify, because the Article 6 negotiations are, as I said before, complicated from a technical point of view and complicated from a political point of view as well. I mean, in many ways, Paris, with regard to Article 6, reflects the most challenging part of the transition from the Kyoto Protocol regime, where we had developed countries only having very specific and very similar targets under the Kyoto Protocol, to a Paris Agreement regime where we have all parties with some form of emissions reduction commitment, of a very, very different character. Under the KP, international emissions trading was relatively straightforward, and accounting for it was relatively straightforward. Each party with a target essentially was assigned a carbon budget, and any transfers through emissions trading between those parties was accounted for by removing a ton from one country's budget as it was transferred to another country's budget. So there were no net emissions reductions as a result, but there were no net emissions increases. And the transfer led to greater cost efficiency, at least in theory. Under the Paris Agreement, we're not in the same situation. Each country has a completely different NDC, which is not immediately transformable into a fungible unit of trade. And so instead, we've had to step in and try to design methods of accounting, of transparency, of tracking, of reporting and reviewing that allow, at least in theory, the trading between countries with very different kinds of NDCs to still be accountable for those transfers in such a way that makes sure that as credit for a ton of greenhouse gases reduced in one jurisdiction is transferred to another jurisdiction, that those two jurisdictions aren't using that same ton reduced to demonstrate compliance with their target. It's just much more difficult to do once you move into this more kind of bottom-up approach to target design. Similarly, under the Kyoto Protocol, we had a clean development mechanism, which was dealing with the certification of offsets, international certification of offsets from developing countries for the transfer to developed countries. Those developing countries didn't have targets, so we were less concerned about their accounting for those emissions reductions. As long as they were certified as having been reduced, if they were transferred to a developed country with a budget, they were added to the budget of that country. Now, under the Paris Agreement, any party can host a project or an activity that is certified internationally. And we have to figure out a way, now that all parties have commitments, to make sure that there is no double counting as project or activity-based emissions reductions are certified and transferred from one country to the other. So the remaining issues, some of the remaining issues that are on the table are about working through the way in which we're going to account for these transfers in a context where we don't have that same uniform target design that made it logical and rational in a Kyoto Protocol context. The other issues that are open have to do with the desire by many developing countries to ensure that there's more predictability and scale to the amount of adaptation finance that's available to developing countries that are facing the impacts of climate change. Under the Kyoto Protocol, we had agreed that the clean development mechanism would be a source of those funds because every time a new unit was issued by the CDM, a share of the proceeds was set aside for the use for adaptation finance. When we agreed the Paris Agreement, we basically carried over that same concept from the clean development mechanism into the Article 6.4 mechanism that will replace the CDM under the Paris Agreement. But what developing countries are asking for now as part of the Article 6 negotiations is that same tax, that same share of the proceeds that has been agreed will apply to the mechanism under Article 6.4 also apply to all international transfers under Article 6.2. That's difficult for developed countries and other parties in negotiations for a number of reasons. One of which is that it feels to us like an international transaction tax on what is essentially a bilateral transaction between two parties. And secondly, it's being asked that we adopt this new international transaction tax through a CMA decision, rather than through the ratification of a treaty instrument that goes back to parliaments and has the approval and endorsement of those parliaments. And the combination of an international tax without the consent of parliaments is something that it's very difficult for many of the delegations to swallow. So that's, a couple of examples of the complexities.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't overcomplicate them or undercomplicate them. It's hard to do them justice and state them simply, but those are a number of issues, as you all know, that are still on the table.
Yeah, there's obviously increasing frustration on the parts of practitioners, on the parts that those that would like to see the book completed, on the part of those that would like to take action. So we do hope that moving forward from here to a Substa session, if we have one in June, and then to a COP26, that we can have final success and move out and actually do. We see a lot of countries, whether Switzerland or Sweden or other, Japan, actually engaging in pilot project, Germany, a lot of countries are being active in that. Mike, let me pass it on to you for a second now so we can move forward. I think that we want to make sure that we give the audience a chance not only to listen to us.
Absolutely. Well, Jake, it's great to have you with us again. I think the last time we had a joint panel was, seems like an age ago, March, no? Something like that. A question I had, you mentioned that we've seen a lot of momentum despite the pandemic, despite the slowdown or the restrictions that has applied on the negotiations when it comes to ambition. And that has indeed been very, very encouraging. And you mentioned specifically some Asian countries, China, of course, with its 2060 target, South Korea, Japan, et cetera, pledging net zero emissions targets. What consequences do you think that has, you know, in your view for, well, what the EU is doing? I know there was some talk of having bilateral meetings, potentially EU and China, et cetera. How's that panning out? And also I see our fellow colleague, our joint colleague, Christina Vogt was asking, you know, does this growing momentum, mushrooming carbon neutrality targets, increase the pressure? She specifically asked about Article 6 to finalize those outstanding issues, but also more broadly.
You're muted, Jake. You're still muted, Jake.
Let me try
There
again.
you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think that the commitment to net zero or climate neutrality several decades into the future is a very still alchemical, mysterious piece of policy. You know, whether it will turn into climate ambition gold or not, I think is not entirely clear. I think for the EU, we are in the process of turning that net zero target into legislation. So to make it legally binding within the European Union, it is now becoming part of a climate law that is been proposed by the Commission and is being negotiated by Parliament and the Council, and hopefully will be finalized this year. Together with making that legally binding, we are putting in place a series of governance arrangements that make sure that we are regularly reviewing our targets as well as our progress towards those targets along trajectories that will get us towards that net zero goal. And all of that is going to be followed up by implementing legislation that will be ready at least to cover our emissions reduction pathways from now until 2030 by mid-June of next year. So a tightening of the ETS, strengthening of renewable energy standards, et cetera, all of that is going to be revised along those same lines. If we see the similar kind of commitment and logical follow-through of making a net zero commitment emerging from the Chinese 5-year plan, emerging from the Japanese energy strategy, emerging from the Korean Green Deal, emerging, frankly, from the Biden campaign promise into the first stages of policy development within a new administration, then we are beginning to spin that distant but incredibly powerful signal into real change. And I think it's a little early to say that. The EU, as always, is trying to sort of set an example and take a lead. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to continue to do that, everything that plays out in the way in which we think and we hope it will, and that others show that kind of follow through as well. The relationship between net zero goals and carbon markets is an interesting one. At least up until now, when you've heard announcements of intentions from climate neutrality, say from the private sector, or from some governments, there has been assumption amongst those that Andre has described as frustrated that we can't agree the rules in Article 6, that climate neutrality can be achieved through the use of offsets. That you can move down as a country or as an economy or as a company towards climate neutrality by continuing to emit, but paying or investing in others to reduce their emissions. That makes sense up to a point. But if what we're talking about is we're talking about in Paris, that the whole planet, in order to achieve 1.5, has to be carbon neutral sometime as soon as possible in the second half of this century. And the IPCC says for carbon dioxide, that means everything by 2050. Then your reliance on carbon markets at least as a source of offsets is misguided. So I think that there has to be a lot of rethinking about what do carbon markets mean in a world where everyone needs to be either net zero or have net negative emissions. It could be a market that is purely designed to trade in carbon removals. So the only thing that gets credit and that's traded are activities that are actually achieving below net zero emissions. But I think that that's something that needs to be reflected on, and certainly in the context of corporate claims of climate neutrality, the extent to which they can. But I don't know whether that's going to drive up or drive down the demand for delivering rules under Article 6. I think that what we're seeing is that at the current level of ambition, if you just look at what the 2030 targets hold, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of demand from the countries that have made those commitments for the use of international carbon markets or international offsets. And you can see that reflected in the price of CDM CERs at the moment, for example.
Excellent, thank you, Jake. There's excellent questions coming in and lots of them, so we'll be really rushing to address them as best we can. And I'll condense two. I know that you'd indicated even before we started broadcasting that it's much too early to speculate about EU and US relations in the climate space and where this transatlantic cooperation might head. But at the same time, we've both spent many years in Washington, D.C. You knew you couldn't avoid at least one question. Two things I think that stood out in the Biden plan released earlier this year was where first, this idea to organize a climate world summit in the first 100 days. And I think many are curious has the EU heard anything about that? Is there already any ideas what that might look like? What do you expect from that? And the second thing is, of course, that President-elect Biden has also mentioned the intention to deploy a border carbon adjustment, something that has had quite a history in US climate policy proposals. And this is also something the EU is working on right now that's attracting a lot of attention, is of course very important internationally. So as part of EU's international climate policy, or with impacts at least for that. So do you have any views on either how those things in the transatlantic relationship might affect EU policy and activities going forward?
Well, thanks, Michael. With that question, you've kind of hit the sweet spot, or the double sweet spot of the things that I'm not really supposed to talk about. One is the speculation on future EU relationships with the new administration, and the other, of course, is speculation on what the Commission's proposal for a carbon border adjustment measure might look like. What I can say is that and this has already been announced by the EU hierarchy, that of course. We welcome the new administration, and for those of us that have been working on climate policy within the Commission, of course we're looking forward to an administration with which we can engage on climate policy, and if even half of the policies that are set out as campaign promises become actual U.S. policy within the coming 6 months or a year, that will be a lot more that we can engage on constructively than we've had with the previous administration. So in that sense, all of that is welcome. I think it's probably true, just looking at the situation in the US now, that the new administration will be able to move more quickly on the international and diplomatic front it will be able in terms of domestic policy. The Biden administration has already indicated, as you know, that they intend to re-enter Paris. Because they view this as an executive agreement, it's something that they can do very quickly without consulting or without the advice and consent of the Senate. And so I think that's a reasonable expectation that they'll be back on board in the Paris Agreement, 30 days after that formality is concluded. And that's a form of leadership, certainly. It's now with 195 parties, the most minimal form of leadership, but it certainly will be a welcome development. In terms of how they revive their efforts that we saw under the Obama administration to kind of lead on climate diplomacy, I think it's still a bit early to say. I personally have not heard the details about what a convening of leaders around climate might look like by a Biden administration. But as you know, the EU has been doing a lot, all that it can, a lot to step into what was a leadership vacuum left by the Trump administration on climate policy. Next year, the UK will be heading the G7, Italy will be heading the G20, and so there will be a lot of Europe-based leadership in this space that the US will obviously be a partner in and a participant in, and so our expectations will lie in that area as well. I agree with your observation that the last time that the US was considering a significant piece of federal legislation on climate policy, it included within it the possibility of making adjustments at the border to protect US competitiveness, to prevent carbon leakage, however they characterized it at the time. And so it would not be a surprise if the US moved in that direction again, that they would have something along those lines. The question I think that anyone would have observing the state of what is likely to be the US Congress and the difficulty in passing legislation on any issue is how you would get to where we are now, to that same point that we were when the Waxman-Markey legislation was moving through the House and had a chance in the Senate, such that the issue of needing to adjust at the border became relevant. So I don't know when we would expect such a proposal, but we certainly have high expectations, as we always do in the United States, to deliver not just leadership at the international level, but also in terms of domestic policy.
Jake, let me ask you another question that I'm sure you like, but we'll stop here. After that, we'll hand it over to other people. But given my history, what I've done in the UNSC negotiation, I have to ask you this. You do have, and you know that ERCST, and I fault Michael that he's not mentioning this, that he doesn't put a plug for the work we do, that we're doing a significant work and good work on border carbon adjustment or the mechanism. But this is something that, do you expect this to have any kind of bearing on discussion at the COP? Is this something that you expect to come up? These have been difficult subjects that have fallen between WTO and UNFCCC in the past. And some people have tried to make hay out of them, not very successfully most of the time, but nevertheless, they have been brought up. Do you expect this to come up at all? I'm sure the EU would prefer not to, but do you get any signals that anybody may raise this?
I mean, in terms of a specific agenda item, no. But the EU is never shy about talking about its climate policies. We're only shy when those climate policies are in the process, so early in the process of their development, that we don't want to say something that might mislead people about what it might look like when it's actually put in place. But with regard to the Commission proposal to come forward with a proposal on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's still in its early phases. We've already begun the process of outreach. Many of our trading partners are interested in this issue, and we talk about what our concerns are with regard to carbon leakage. and we talk about the general outlines of the political guidance that we receive from EU leaders in order to guide the process. First and foremost of which is it must be WTO compliant and therefore must be rational, reasonable, justifiable from an environmental perspective, et cetera. So as the proposal becomes more concrete, we will be doing even more outreach. And although it's not contemplated that it will be in place, certainly by the end of next year, a proposal is being developed for publication the middle of next year. And if our partners want to talk about this policy, we will talk about this policy along with all the other EU climate and energy policies that we are proud of.
Let me hand it over now to Casper Kaiser. Casper, you have, if you want to unmute yourself and show yourself, would be helpful.
Certainly.
And introduce yourself very briefly, but let's try and keep the comments short and the question, if possible.
Yeah, sure. I am working now for the Dutch government, and I see that in the last a year that there are a few bush fires, and like that, and like those things put a lot of carbon in the air, and I am not so sure that like those emissions are being counted at the
international level.
At like that level, and like also I would like to know what that would mean for the NDCs. Then, so that is my comment, my question.
Thank you, Casper. Thank you very much. Jake, shall I see if there's a couple of more? If there's anybody else, if not, what I'll do is I'll raise one issue in here that somebody mentioned, which I find also interesting, and we have been preoccupied with Pascal Sigbert. How do you see the future of voluntary carbon markets? So there is that issue of, I don't want to get into the technicalities, but there is the politics of interrelationship between Article 6, ICAO, voluntary markets, all this kind of interrelationship. This is something that is bound to be affecting ambition, and not only in the NDCs, but also in ICAO and so on. You're gonna take these two questions maybe together, and then we'll move off. If there's other people that want to raise their hand, happy. If not, we'll read them from the list from the chat. So the one was about the bush fires, and the other one was about this interrelationship between these various aspects.
Okay, I mean, I won't be claim to be an expert on either of these, and maybe Michael and Andre can help me out. But in terms of bushfires, I mean, one of the slides that I often use in trying to describe why there is so much European public support for action on climate change are photographs of forest fires in the Arctic and in the Mediterranean that have been happening recently within the EU, and that really does bring home to Europeans in a way, I think even more than sea level rise has, of the impacts of climate change that we are currently feeling as a result of extreme weather, extreme temperatures, and extreme pressure that's being brought on our natural ecosystems. So those fires are happening even within the EU. Of course, we're concerned about them around the world, in Indonesia and Brazil. There is no question that the atmosphere experiences that additional dump of carbon dioxide, but also the soot from forest fires can fall out on snow and glaciers in the form of black carbon, which can also increase temperature locally and can enhance the impacts of global warming as well by reducing the reflective character of otherwise bright spaces on the planet. So they are significant in terms of the way in which the atmosphere experiences them. In terms of how they're accounted, this becomes very technical. And even the international rules on accounting for land use change in forestry haven't been 100% harmonized yet. I know that there's a concept referred to as natural disturbances. When forest fires occur naturally, they tend to emit, but then the natural regrowth of the forest tends to make those neutralize those emissions. So there's an extent to which countries with forests that are sustainably managed but experience forest fires don't account for those as net emissions in the expectation that the forest will grow back and produce a net zero result. And that's about as far as my understanding, I think, takes me. But again, moving towards a world of net zero, this means, as Paris describes it, not just emissions and not just industrial emissions, but also the uptake of emissions from natural sources such as forests, and the emissions from those forests. Because at the end of the day, if you're moving to net zero with the goal of preventing 1.5 degrees, it doesn't matter what the cause of those emissions is. You either have to stop them from happening or compensate them by removing more greenhouse gases from the atmosphere when they occur. So if they're not accounted for fully currently, they will have to be accounted for if we're going to reach that 1.5 degree goal. On Article 6, ICAO and voluntary markets, this is a relatively dynamic space, that there is an increased demand for offsets that's emerging from, as I described before, individual companies wanting to declare that they're moving towards climate neutrality, or they're beginning to manage their emissions, including through the use of offsets. And that we're seeing from the emergence of CORSIA, this regime under ICAO that applies to commercial aviation, where that sector has made a commitment to not grow their emissions beyond 2020 levels, and the use of offsets to help them to achieve that goal. That is creating a bit more demand of what people refer to as voluntary offsets, and in some circumstance, compliance-related offsets as well. What that means from an Article 6 perspective, in my view, is that increasingly we have to link up these regimes for accounting purposes. We can't have a situation where a commercial airline is using an offset from a country that is under a Paris Agreement obligation through their NDC, and that host country for that emissions reduction being used by a commercial airline to meet its ICAO obligation is not being accounted for when the host country of that emission is not accounting for it under Paris. So we have to figure out a way over time and hopefully quite quickly to make sure that we're not crediting actors for achieving their international obligations under one regime in a way that undermines our confidence that another actor is achieving its international obligation under another regime. And these voluntary offsets, which move in this space, need to be better understood and accounted for to make sure that they aren't undermining our ability to achieve the goals that we've set in Paris.
Great, thanks, Jake. Yeah, I'll call on one of the raised hands, Sergei Raginka, and allow you to talk.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen, for such an informative discussion. I have one brief question concerning a universally adopted price on carbon. So what do you think, Jacob, of this opportunity?
I'd have to better understand what it looks like. I mean, economists certainly tell us that the most efficient way of getting global emissions under control is making sure that in every jurisdiction there is a price on carbon, in accordance with the concept of polluter pays, the concept of needing to internalize externalities. It makes sense that if you are polluting, you're paying a price for that pollution in the form of a carbon price. The way in which we're moving towards that in a practical way, as opposed to the way in which economists might imagine it, is by countries moving forward on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, like the EU is with the ETS, like China is through their ETS, to put in place a carbon price through carbon markets. Other jurisdictions are using taxes. Other jurisdictions are using regulation, which increases the cost of emissions without directly assigning a price to it. Very few of these jurisdictions put in place a legislated price. So you would get that from a tax. You don't get that from an ETS. Our carbon price within the EU goes up and down in response to supply and demand for those units. But you don't, even within those jurisdictions that are taking pricing approaches, get a single price at the moment. So we're moving gradually in that direction as more and more countries seek to regulate their emissions. And you're either getting implied prices or published prices or prices generated by auctions, but it's not a single universal global carbon price. As the different regimes begin to link, as we are now linking with Switzerland, obviously the price will clear, as economists say, so that the price of a ton of carbon should be the same in Switzerland and in the EU. And so in that sense, you're achieving a single price. But it's only, I think, still an economist's dream that we have a global emissions trading system where a single price is being generated by a fully functioning international carbon market.
Well, Jake, what are the odds? We had two Sergeys raising their hand at the same time. So now the second Sergey Raginka.
Hello. Let me present myself. I'm chairing the Climate Policy Subcommittee of the Russian Chamber of Commerce. Here is one question from practitioners. Are there any plans in the EU to install limits for the Articles 6 reductions within the EU ETS, just as you did during the times of Kyoto Protocol? And second question, what are your forecasts about the future price of EU allowance?
Jake, that last one is a killer.
And not only is it, I suppose it's a killer, but I wouldn't know how to answer it. I haven't seen, or I haven't carried out those projections myself, but I haven't seen them either. But I mean, it seems to me obvious if you're moving towards net zero, the role of a carbon market is going to decline over time because there will be fewer emissions. But in any case, I don't have a projection for what happens between now and then in terms of a price in the EU ETS. With regard to demand for Article 6 units, I think the question is focused on probably Article 6.4 units.
Yes.
So these are emissions reduction units that would be generated under the mechanism under Article 6.4 and internationally certified. The Commission proposal, which Andre mentioned in his opening remarks, of moving from our current target of at least 40% to a target of at least 55% emissions reductions from 1990 levels by 2030, is a domestic proposal. So it is not modeled in the anticipation of the use of international offsets. So we, at least in terms of Commission proposal, we do not anticipate being a source of demand for those units.
Jake, there's one question here that going back to Cookie who is an Article 6 negotiator from Jakarta, asking about the impact of the entry into force of the Doha Amendment.
Hi, Cookie. How are you? Nice to know that you're online. Well, it's a very interesting question. It's something that we've actually been thinking through a lot at the Commission, because many of our colleagues who were part of the design of the Doha Amendment and carry all that kind of institutional history are not around anymore. So we've had to do some research to figure out what exactly the implications of Doha entry into force are. For those of you who don't know, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, which was going to set in place the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, was adopted in, I think, 2012. People correct me if I'm wrong, but back at the Doha COP. And it was intended to create a second commitment period that would run from 2013 to 2020. It was designed to enter into force when 144 parties had ratified it. That only happened on I think it was the first week of October, meaning that it will now enter into force at the end of this year, 2020. So essentially, it will come into force just as the commitment period that it establishes ends. So for the EU and for the maybe one or two other Annex B parties that actually have commitments under the Doha Amendment, its entry into force means, as a practical matter, very little. Fortunately, the EU has been, in essence, implementing the Doha Amendment from the moment that it was adopted. And although it didn't enter into force, we are anticipating to have overachieved the obligations that it set for us, which was a 20% emissions reduction commitment by 2020. And so we will be fully compliant with the Doha Amendment as it enters into force. I think the only party, and this is where I may be wrong, that has a commitment, an active commitment under the Doha Amendment, and that has also ratified it, is Australia, and they also expect to overcomply. Switzerland, I think, is also bound, and we expect them to be in compliance as well. And that's because all of these countries that had targets have been doing whatever they needed to do under the Doha Amendment in any case to achieve them. So the impact of entry into force is really quite minimal. I don't think that means that the Doha Amendment wasn't a very important agreement. It was essential to the politics of getting the negotiations of the Paris Agreement underway. The EU ratified it in pretty good time, have encouraged other parties to ratify it as well, and it certainly provided additional reasons for us to meet the commitments that we made and that we're now, as of the end of this year, will be bound by.
Jacob, we have a few minutes left. We have three people that I'd like to give the floor to before we conclude: Tobias Grass, Jennifer Hoang, and Pascal Sigver. Tobias is from the Danish Agricultural Council. Tobias, you want to start? Let's try and keep it short so you can ask the question and Jake has time to answer.
Thank you very much, Andre. A quick question. You touched upon, Mr. Werksman, the importance, the centrality of removals in the context of climate neutrality. Might you see the prospect of a removals market in the EU? We saw that the Parliament passed an amendment that seeks to explore that possibility.
Jennifer, if you want to introduce yourself briefly and take the floor.
Sure. I'm the Senior International Fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. So on a webinar yesterday, Jake, one of your European colleagues said she was glad that Biden was elected, but also kind of qualified her happiness by saying that she hoped that the Biden administration would take a more strategic approach to re-entry into the international climate diplomacy space by kind of assessing the landscape that we have now. And this is one of like a distributed leadership. She, mentioned it might be disruptive or maybe even counterproductive to do things like come in and just replace the MOCAs with a new MAF. So I just want to know what your thoughts are on how the US can kind of boost ongoing efforts rather than disrupt them as they re-enter the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
And last but not least, Pascal from Total, I believe, yes. But you are mute, Pascal. I think that you should unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yes, I am Pascal Silva from Total, and I would like to ask a question on carbon capture and storage. How do you see this technology playing a role for Europe? And how do you see regulation finally enabling business model to, if you think that we need this technology to roll out significant capacity and not stay only at project level, I would say individual project levels? And how, do you see also as a CCUS as a transitory situation, or would you see CCUS as a more permanent asset? For instance, CCUS could be a strong asset as a backbone to over time become, BECCS, bioenergy CCS. So if you are financing and decarbonizing fast with existing fossil carbon, you could over time also benefit from the infrastructure to continue to decarbonize the atmosphere.
Jake, you've got a few minutes here for these questions, and important questions. Some of them are more elaborate than others, but go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take Tobias and Pascal's question together as they both deal with removals. Every model, including the European models that look at how you can, in a cost-effective way, achieve net zero emissions by 2050, include an element of carbon dioxide removal. A combination, at least in our models, of the removal through bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and a hope that we will be developing more cost-effective ways of carbon capture and storage, either direct air or from industrial processes. So we are counting on those technologies being available. And given that we can't count on the rest of the world moving as quickly as they have to, we are imagining in the EU of going to not just net zero, but GHG negative. And so that means even more of a need to rely on these technologies. They have to come across in a cost-effective way. I would imagine, though I'm stepping beyond my area of expertise, that part of that would be using market mechanisms, including something like a carbon removals market, to reduce the costs of the introduction of these technologies. And they will require a significant investment, public-private partnership in innovation in those technologies up to scale and in place. So I would expect all of that to happen within the EU and all other significant emitters that are taking this issue seriously. I'm glad, Jennifer, it's great to hear your voice as well, and to know that you're in DC and that you and the many think tanks and advisors and NGOs that will be close to a Biden administration transition will be there to give them advice on how best to exercise that combination of leadership and awareness and appreciation that the world has been on a bit of a roller coaster ride with regard to US climate policy, and needs to have more assurances, even more assurances than in the past, that, as I said before, the leadership on the international stage of every country has to be based on their ability to deliver domestically as well. And so I would imagine that the convenings of the G20, which will be led by Italy, as I said before, will encourage that kind of attitude and reflection from all the G20 members. So that's the kind of leadership that we would expect from any major economy.
Very well, Michael. Do you want to anything in to close this conversation from your side?
No, but I do owe Jake thanks for navigating tricky questions about the transatlantic issue in a very diplomatic way. So thanks for doing that.
Jake, thank you very much for being with us. I think that there were still about over 150 people kind of hanging around, listening to a very interesting discussion. You are in a series, this discussion, a series of discussion we had, including Carsten Zach, including Khalid Aboulief, people that contribute and shape and participate in an influential way in the climate change discussion, especially at the international level. In ERCST, we pride ourselves to be based in Brussels, be European think tank, but also pride ourselves to try and bring the international dimension in the Brussels bubble. We don't call it a beltway, that's somewhere else, we call it a bubble. So Jake, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope to have you again here in the future as things evolve. It sounds to me like you are optimistic about the coming year. This year has been for many not a very good baseline, but we hope that next year is going to be an improvement, and we wish you and all of us well in dealing with this issue. Thank you very much again, and thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you, Andre and Michael. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. I hope that I was said enough to be interesting without saying too much to get myself into trouble, but it was an enjoyable couple of hours in any case. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Jake.